There's a particular kind of silence that fills a car when you already know what's coming will cost you something, and you've decided to pay it anyway, no matter what. I sat in the back seat of a government sedan, pulled over on a stretch of road in Virginia. A steel security cable looped once around my wrist and locked to the aluminum case on the seat beside me, reading the same paragraph of a briefing memo for the fourth time without absorbing a single word.
The case held a procurement decision still in draft form, worth more money than most people earn across 4 lifetimes combined. In about 90 minutes, I had to stand in a hotel ballroom pretending to care about the hors d'oeuvres. And about 14 hours after that, I had to board a plane to sign my name to a number with more zeros than I wanted to say out loud. But that wasn't why my hands weren't quite steady.
The reason was that my daughter had asked me to come to a party her grandmother was hosting, and it had been 4 years since I'd set foot in that family's world.
My name is Elena Cross. I hold the rank of colonel in the United States Marine Corps, and for the past 3 years I've run the office that decides which weapons, which armor, which medevac contracts, and which billion-dollar defense proposals actually get built, actually get fielded, and which ones quietly die in a drawer. It isn't work that announces itself. Nobody in a ballroom looks at a woman in a plain navy dress carrying an aluminum case and thinks she's the reason their company's stock went up or down last quarter.
That anonymity had suited me for a long time. It stopped suiting me the day my daughter, 17, careful with every word in the way children learn to be once they understand that hope is expensive, texted me, "There's a gala. Grandma's hosting it. I want you there. Don't tell her I asked." I told the driver to keep going. The Ashford Legacy Foundation's In Honor of Service Gala was held at a hotel outside Washington, the kind of lobby with a piano nobody plays and flower arrangements that cost more than renting the sedan I'd arrived in. My former mother-in-law, Diane Ashford, had founded the foundation 12 years earlier as a monument to herself, conveniently tax-deductible, and every year she filled the ballroom with defense contractors, retired generals hunting for board seats, and journalists who wrote the word philanthropist the way other people write saint. I checked the case at Coat Check more carefully than I've ever checked anything else, under a name that meant nothing to the young man behind the counter, then walked into the ballroom in a navy dress, with no insignia, no ribbons, nothing that would tell a stranger who I was. It had taken me 23 years to learn just how invisible a person can make herself, and that night, I wanted to find out whether that invisibility still worked on the one family that had long ago decided how small I was allowed to be.
I had my answer within 4 minutes.
A woman near the raw seafood table, seeing me pause to look around for my daughter, waved me over the way you'd wave down a member of the waitstaff. "Sorry, could you clear the tray at table 9, and the champagne station's running low on ice?" I told her, without any edge in my voice, that I wasn't part of the event staff. She apologized, smiled a little too brightly, and walked off, forgetting me instantly. It wasn't malice. It's just what happens when a room decides, in a single glance, which category you belong to, and doesn't bother updating the file. I found a spot near a pillar and let myself actually look at the room while I waited to spot my daughter. I recognized 3 sitting generals, 2 undersecretaries, and at least 4 CEOs whose signatures I'd seen on cover letters thicker than most novels. People who would have stood at attention if they'd known which office decided the fate of their proposals, and who instead drifted past me toward the bar without a second glance. I'd spent 23 years learning to read exactly this kind of room. It occurred to me, standing there unnoticed, that I'd learned it in rooms very much like this one, long before I ever met Diane Ashford. Diane found me 11 minutes later. She crossed the room the way she always did, chin leading, a woman who had spent 6 decades being the most important person in every conversation she walked into. She looked me up and down, the dress, the flat shoes, the total absence of jewelry, and something on her face settled into an expression I remembered well, the tired, familiar look of a woman deciding exactly how much of tonight she was willing to spend reminding me of my place.
"Oh," she said, "you actually came."
Maddie asked me to.
Maddie is 17. She doesn't always know what's good for her.
Diane's eyes swept past me, checking who stood close enough to hear, and once she was satisfied the right people were in range, she lowered her voice to something almost gentle, the register she always used to deliver her worst lines. "You know, I don't understand why you'd want to stand in a room like this, Elena. This is a place for people who've actually built something. If you're hungry, go get a plate from the kitchen. I just don't think you should be circulating."
I didn't answer right away. 3 decades in rooms exactly like this one had taught me that the fastest way to hand someone power is to let them see their words land. So I looked at her the way I look at a supply chain risk assessment, thorough, unhurried, and said, "I can take care of myself."
"Suit yourself." She wore the smile she always used when she believed a conversation was over and she'd won, then turned to greet a state senator with a laugh loud enough to reach 3 tables away. "I want to be honest about one thing, because it matters for everything that happened afterward. I walked into that ballroom with no plan at all. I hadn't come to expose anyone, humiliate anyone, or collect a debt I'd stayed silent about for years. I came because a 17-year-old girl who had spent most of her life believing the wrong story about her mother had quietly asked me to stand in that room so she could see the truth for herself." That story began 11 years earlier, in a kitchen in Annapolis, with Diane Ashford standing in the doorway, while Preston packed a bag. I wasn't the one who wanted the divorce. I want to say that plainly, because for years I let people believe the opposite, out of a stubborn kind of pride that made explaining myself feel beneath me. The truth is simpler and less flattering for everyone involved. Preston had married a young Marine captain because it sounded interesting at cocktail parties, and Diane had tolerated me for exactly as long as it took her to realize that interesting and acceptable didn't belong in the same column of her ledger. "She's enlisted Preston," I once heard her say through a half-closed door in the 2nd year of our marriage. "A woman who lives by taking orders. What does she actually bring to this family, besides a uniform and a chip on her shoulder?"
I was a captain then. 6 years into a commission I'd earned with a mechanical engineering degree and an officer accession pipeline Diane never once asked me about, because asking would have meant treating me as a person worth understanding instead of a category worth dismissing. She never learned the difference between an officer and enlisted personnel, and I came to understand she had no interest in learning it. Precision would have complicated her prejudice, and that prejudice was load-bearing. It held up her whole picture of who belonged to her family and who was, at best, a temporary tenant.
Maddie was 6 when Diane finally got what she wanted. I won't pretend that marriage would have survived without her interference. Preston and I had our own failures, our own long silences, and I've never claimed the fault was entirely his family's. But I will say that when Preston came home from a Sunday dinner at his mother's and told me, almost apologetically, that maybe we rushed into something we weren't ready for, I recognized his mother's phrasing before I even registered my own grief. The custody arrangement that followed was engineered as carefully as everything else Diane wanted to control. I was on an assignment that had me deploying every 3 weeks at the time. Preston's lawyer, quietly paid for by his mother, built a case around my deployment instability, turning an ordinary, unremarkable rotation cycle into something that sounded like abandonment. On paper, I had alternating weekends and half the summer. In practice, I got whatever Diane allowed, and every year it shrank a little more, each time wrapped in a reason that sounded almost reasonable. A recital that conflicted, a family trip that couldn't be moved, a birthday that had already been arranged around the people who were actually there. I could have fought harder. I've turned that fact over more times than I can count, at 2 in the morning, in barracks on 3 different coastlines. I had the resources. Eventually, I had the rank. What I didn't have was the stomach to turn my daughter into a battlefield. And so I did the thing people who've never been in that position always mistake for weakness, when it's actually the hardest kind of discipline there is. I let go of ground I could have fought for, because fighting would have cost Maddie more than it cost me. Diane filled that ground the moment I stopped holding it. The ballroom noise pulled me back for a moment. A burst of laughter near the bar, glass against glass, and then it faded again, the way memory does when it isn't finished with you yet. Your mother chose her career over you. I only learned years later that she used to say, not cruelly, but almost sadly, the way people describe a family tragedy nobody could have stopped. Some women just can't do both. It's not your mother's fault. It's just the truth. She told Maddie other things too, over the years, each one small enough to seem harmless standing alone. That I lived paycheck to paycheck. That I'd left the military years earlier under circumstances nobody discussed. That the reason I didn't call more often was because I'd built a life with no room in it for a daughter. By the time Maddie was 12, she believed, because why wouldn't she, hearing it from the one grandmother she saw every week, that her mother was a woman who'd trade her family for a modest government salary and a small apartment somewhere, someone more to be pitied than resented. I let her believe that longer than I'm proud of. Correcting it meant either exposing Diane as a liar to a child who loved her, or explaining the real nature of my work in a level of detail security clearance didn't allow, and honestly, I wasn't sure a 12-year-old needed to know that much anyway. So I called every week. I sent cards. I showed up to whatever events I was permitted to attend and sat in the back row so I wouldn't complicate anyone's photographs. And I said almost nothing about who I actually was, because I'd convinced myself that silence was a form of love, that not forcing my daughter to choose between two versions of her mother's story was worth more than the cost of letting the wrong version stand unchallenged.
What I hadn't fully understood at the time was that an uncorrected story doesn't stay still. It hardens. And a 14-year-old who spent 8 years hearing that her mother is someone you feel awkward mentioning doesn't just wake up one day and think differently. Something had to crack the story open first.
Somewhere behind me, a string quartet started tuning up for the evening's program, 3 sharp notes that didn't quite belong together yet. The distance between the woman Diane described at those Sunday dinners and the woman I actually was had widened, year after posting, in ways nobody at that table ever thought to ask about. I made major while Maddie was still in elementary school, running logistics for a Marine Expeditionary Unit rotation that kept me at sea more than I was home, learning early that the fastest way for a woman in procurement to lose a room's respect was to explain herself, and the fastest way to earn it was to simply be right, over and over, until the explaining stopped being necessary. I made lieutenant colonel untangling a stalled armor contract nobody else wanted to touch, the kind of assignment that earns a commendation nobody outside that building ever reads. Colonel came 7 years after that, along with a bureau of my own, 40 analysts, and a signature that could unlock or permanently block a contract worth more than the annual budget of several small countries. None of it came from ceremony. It came from midnight video calls 3 time zones from my own bed, from learning to read a vendor's financials as carefully as a threat assessment, from earning trust one unglamorous audit at a time, from people with every institutional reason not to extend that trust to a woman who'd never come up through a fighter squadron or an infantry battalion. I never told any of it to Diane, not because I was keeping a secret, but because I'd learned, long before I met her, that some rooms only want to hear the parts of your life that confirm what they've already decided about you, and correcting that belief costs more than it's worth, unless someone in the room is actually listening. For Maddie, the crack came from a school assignment, not from me. She'd been given a project, at 16, researching a family member's career for a civics unit on public service. She told me later, after everything, on the drive home from the gala I'm about to describe, that she'd typed my name into a public records search tool, mostly out of boredom, expecting nothing, and found a base newspaper article from 10 years earlier about a logistics award, with a photograph of a much younger version of me standing beside people in flight suits in front of a transport aircraft. The article didn't say anything about you being poor, she told me. It said you'd redesigned a supply chain, cut 11 days off the shipping time for emergency medical equipment. I didn't understand all the words, but it didn't sound like someone who didn't care about showing up. She didn't confront Diane. She told me that by then she understood too well how her grandmother handled being questioned, the patient, wounded disappointment that made you feel cruel just for asking, and she wasn't ready to face that yet. So she did something smaller, but braver. She started texting me more. She started asking real questions instead of polite ones. And 3 weeks before the gala, she asked me to come. I didn't know walking into that ballroom that Diane had invited one more person that night, someone she'd spent 4 months courting with the specific, focused hunger of a woman who'd learned that a large enough donation buys a permanent line on a foundation's letterhead. Richard Voss was the chief executive of Meridian Defense Systems, one of the 3 largest weapons and logistics conglomerates in the country. And according to the folded Gala program on every table, he was a distinguished veteran and generous friend of the Ashford Legacy Foundation. Nobody at that dinner had bothered to read the fine print of his printed biography closely enough to notice the detail buried in it, almost as an afterthought. A single deployment with a Marine Expeditionary Reconnaissance Company in Helmand Province, 21 years earlier.
I noticed because I'd been there.
Preston found me not long after Diane walked off, a drink already in hand, the loose confidence of a man 3 glasses into an evening he expected to be admired in. On paper, he'd done reasonably well for himself. Ashford Aerotech, the small aviation components and system subcontractor he'd started 9 years earlier with seed money from his mother, had grown from a struggling 4-person shop into something that had, in the last 18 months, landed what he liked to call, whenever he could work it into conversation, a serious national security contract. I'd heard him say that line twice already that night to 2 different groups of donors, each time with the same falsely modest tone that wasn't modest at all.
Didn't expect to see you here, he said, looking me up and down the same way his mother had. Still doing the, what do they call it now? Logistics? Something with trucks?
Something like that? He laughed, short and a little too loud, the laugh of a man who wants a witness for his own humor. You know Mom means well. She just worries about Maddie's image. High school's hard enough without, he gestured vaguely at me, at the plain dress, at the total absence of anything that signaled success in the language his family spoke fluently, without extra complications.
I'm not a complication, Preston. I'm her mother.
Sure. He took a sip. You know what's funny? Ashford Aerotech's about to close something huge, life-changing kind of huge. Vance, he got himself, laughed again. Sorry, force of habit. I mean the review board, is supposed to wrap up in a few weeks. Mom's hoping Voss brings it up tonight if she plays this right. Basically, the whole future of the company comes down to one signature. He grinned at me, like he was letting me in on a secret, the way you'd toss a stray dog a scrap of bone. Anyway, enjoy the shrimp.
He walked off toward the bar without waiting to find out whether I did. I stood there for a moment, my drink untouched, because something in what he just said snagged against something I already knew, and I wasn't ready to look at it directly yet.
6 weeks earlier, sitting in my office with 3 analysts and a stack of subcontractor risk files, I'd signed off on a routine compliance review for a small aviation components vendor, flagged for expedited processing under a Tier 2 logistics subcontract, part of a program my bureau oversees. The vendor's name was Ashford Aerotech. I remember reading it, feeling the small, cold jolt of recognition, and then doing exactly what 19 years of training had drilled into me. I picked up the phone, disclosed the personal relationship to my deputy, and formally recused myself from any individual review of that file, in writing, that same afternoon. I never looked at another page of it.
Standing in that ballroom, I had no idea whether my recusal had ever been recorded anywhere Preston or Diane would see it, and I intended to keep it that way. Whatever happened to that file, it would never pass through my hands, in either direction. Not favor, not payback.
I want to be clear that I felt no triumph standing there, turning that fact over. If anything, I felt tired. The people who'd spent a decade telling my daughter I'd contributed nothing had, without knowing it, built a company whose survival now depended directly on the office I ran, and none of them had the faintest idea. 6 weeks earlier, I'd chosen to keep it that way. Some of the heaviest power you can hold is the kind you refuse to use. A few minutes later, an event staffer approached me with a clipboard, wearing the careful, apologetic smile organizations save for people they've already decided don't quite belong. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. It looks like we don't have a place cart for you at any table. Mrs. Ashford's office only finalized the family seating chart this afternoon. There's an open seat at table 22 near the kitchen door, if that works." I understood what had happened before she finished the sentence. Diane hadn't forgotten to add my name to the chart. She'd simply never written it down at all, the same way she'd never written me into any version of this family story she was willing to tell out loud. I told the young woman it was fine, and I meant it. Not because it didn't sting, but because the seating chart was small enough to lose without losing anything that actually mattered. I found a spot near the back wall instead, close enough to see Maddie, far enough to stay out of anyone's photographs,
and from across the room I watched Diane check her own table twice, satisfied that I'd understood a rule she never had to say out loud. Maddie found me near the edge of the room a while later, in a green dress that made her look, for one startled second, exactly like photographs of me at her age. "You came," she said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Not quite gratitude, closer to relief, like a held breath finally let go.
You asked me to.
"I wasn't sure you would." She glanced toward the crowd near the stage, where a small podium had been set up with the Ashford Legacy Foundation crest projected behind it. "She's about to speak in a few minutes. She does it every year, usually about Dad."
I'll stay and listen.
"You don't have to."
I know, I said, but I want to.
She looked at me for a moment, the careful, assessing look of a teenager trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. Then, quietly, she said, "I looked you up a few months ago for an assignment." Something in my chest went very still. There was an article about some supply chain thing. I didn't understand all of it. You never told me about it.
"You never asked," I said, as gently as I could manage, "and I never wanted you to feel like you had to pick a side to love me."
She didn't answer that directly, but she stood a little closer to me for the rest of the conversation, and when the lights dimmed for Diane's speech, she didn't drift toward her father the way I'd half expected. She stayed beside me.
Diane's speech started exactly the way I remembered from the 3 earlier galas I'd been reluctantly permitted to attend in the years right after the divorce. She talked about legacy. She talked about the Foundation's mission to support veterans who had given everything and asked for nothing, a phrase I'd heard her use so many times it had long since stopped meaning anything to me. She talked, with unmistakable pride, about Preston, about watching him build Ashford Aerotech from nothing, about a mother's joy at seeing her son carry the family's values into a new generation of service, even if he served that country in a boardroom instead of a uniform, a distinction she framed skillfully as its own kind of sacrifice.
Then, because a woman like Diane can never resist reaching for the detail that always works when she feels an audience's attention start to sag, she went for the line that had never failed her.
"Preston has had to be both mother and father to the beautiful young woman standing right there," she said, gesturing toward Maddie, her voice warming into the tone she used for her favorite applause line. "It hasn't been easy. Some people build a family. Others," she paused, the practiced beat she'd learned to hold exactly as long as it took before landing the rest of the sentence, "choose a different kind of life. We don't judge that choice. We just make sure the people who stayed are seen tonight."
A polite, uncomfortable ripple of laughter moved through the tables closest to the podium, the kind of laugh people make when they sense cruelty dressed up as sentiment and aren't sure they're allowed to notice. I felt Maddie go rigid beside me before I even saw her face. I didn't need to look to know exactly what that line had just done, delivered in front of 200 donors, a lifestyle magazine photographer, and the very daughter it was actually aimed at. I'd absorbed worse than this from Diane for 11 years and learned to let it pass like weather. This was different. This time she'd used my daughter, publicly, in exchange for applause. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move toward the podium. A whole career had taught me that the worst thing you can do in the middle of someone else's performance is give them a bigger one to react against. So I stood very still, rested my hand gently on Maddie's shoulder, and said quietly, just for her, "That isn't true, and you know more of the truth than she thinks you do." She looked at me, her eyes bright with an anger I hadn't seen since she was small enough for my presence alone to fix everything. "How do you know I know?" "Because," I said, "some people build their whole lives on a story, and they've told it so long they've stopped checking whether it's still true." That was the moment the room's attention shifted, not because of anything I'd done, but because of a small stir starting near the entrance, that particular ripple that moves through a crowd when everyone pretends at once not to notice that someone important has just arrived. Richard Voss walked through the ballroom doors, 2 aides flanking him, a tall man in his mid-40s carrying the particular stillness of someone who has survived something the rest of the room has only ever read about.
Diane spotted him from the podium and abandoned the ending of her speech mid-sentence, with the smooth, practiced pivot of a woman who has spent her career redirecting toward money. She came down off the small stage quickly, hand already extended, her voice climbing to the register she reserved for the people who mattered most.
Mr. Voss, we're so honored. I hope Preston mentioned.
He didn't stop walking. I watched it happen from about 20 feet away, and I want to describe it exactly as it occurred, because for one full second, he looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost. His eyes swept the room the way you'd expect from someone working a circle of donors, polite, assessing, already braced for the next handshake. And then his gaze landed on me, standing near the edge of the room, my hand still on my daughter's shoulder, and every trace of professional, composed expression vanished from his face at once.
He went pale in a way I've only seen twice in my career, both times in the seconds right after something had gone seriously, irreversibly wrong, and someone had recognized it half a second before everyone else. His two aides, half a step behind him, exchanged a glance and stopped short, unsure what had just changed.
He walked straight past Diane's outstretched hand as if it wasn't there.
"Ma'am." His voice, once he reached me, was low, taut, carrying the exact formality of someone who had spent most of his life inside a chain of command and had never fully left it. He stopped about 3 feet away and came to something close to attention, the way you stand in front of someone whose authority you've never once doubted. "Colonel Cross, I didn't know you'd be here tonight."
Diane, still mid-stride, stopped so abruptly her heel caught the edge of the carpet. "I'm sorry, Colonel?"
Voss didn't look at her. His eyes hadn't left me. "Ma'am, I need a few minutes of your time if you can spare them. I know this isn't the place, but I've been trying to reach your office for 2 days about the Meridian subcontract package. My board is waiting on your bureau's approval before we can move on anything else, and I'll be honest with you." His jaw tightened. "I wasn't planning to raise this at a social event, but since you're standing here, I'd rather ask directly than keep going through channels that clearly aren't reaching you fast enough. Whatever you need from us to move things along, more documentation, a full compliance walkthrough, my personal signature on anything, you have it. I mean that. Whatever it takes."
Somewhere nearby, a woman actually drew in a breath, quietly, the sound of someone realizing in real time that the social order of the evening had just been rearranged. "Mr. Voss," I said, keeping my voice level, aware of how many people around us had gone still. "I appreciate you raising it, but you understand I can't discuss an active procurement decision at a charity gala." "Understood." He nodded once, sharply, and then something in his composure cracked, just slightly, into something more personal. "I also owe you a conversation I've never had the chance to have. I've wanted it for 21 years, and I never had the courage to go looking for you, and now here you are." He glanced briefly at the small crowd that had gathered without quite meaning to, then lowered his voice further, though not quite low enough to keep the people closest from hearing every word. "Helmand, the wadi north of the district center. My platoon was pinned down for 6 hours, 2 men bleeding out, and every request for an armored quick reaction force was sitting in someone's inbox, waiting on the right signature. I was 24. I remember a logistics captain I'd never met getting on the radio and telling the command she'd authorize the deployment under her own authority, and if anyone had a problem with that, they could take it up with her directly. His voice caught for a moment before he studied it. "It took me years to learn your name. I only found it after I got out because I wanted to know who to thank. It was you." The room fell into a very particular kind of silence, the kind that settles when 200 people realize, all at once, that they're witnessing something they were never meant to see. It had been a long time since I'd let myself think about that night, not because it didn't matter, but because I'd trained myself deliberately not to lead with it. It's the kind of story that can make people treat you like a legend instead of a colleague, and legends don't get taken seriously in budget meetings. I'd never told Preston. I certainly had never told Diane. It was simply a decision, on one terrible night, among thousands of decisions spread across 23 years, and I'd let it settle into the same category of silence as everything else I never explained.
You made it back, I said, because it was true, and because it seemed like the only thing that fit the moment better than an audience did. That's what matters.
11 of us made it back, he said, because of a decision that could have ended your career if things had gone differently. I know how high that cost could have been for you. I've spent 2 decades in this industry learning exactly what it costs to go around the chain of command, even when you're right, especially when you're right. For the first time, he glanced past me, toward Diane, still frozen with her champagne glass tilted at an angle that was about to become a problem, and toward Preston, who had arrived beside her in the last 30 seconds, his drink forgotten in his hand. "I'm sorry, I don't think I caught either of your names." No one answered him right away. I watched the exact moment the room's private arithmetic finished recalculating who I was, moving from table to table like water finding the lowest point. Diane's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the parquet floor with a small, brittle crack that sounded enormous in that silence, wine spreading dark across the wood in a shape someone would have to clean up. And this time, nobody looked at me to do it. "Colonel," Voss said quietly, "if there's anything—" "There isn't," I said. "Thank you, Mr. Voss. My office will reach out to yours through the proper channels on Monday. Tonight, I'm only here for my daughter." He nodded, understanding immediately. The way people who've served understand exactly when a conversation stops being about them. He offered his hand, I shook it, and he stepped back with a small formal bow of the head. A man returning something he'd borrowed, leaving space for the room to keep absorbing what it had just witnessed. By then, Maddie was crying, not loudly, just steady tears, her hand gripping my arm hard enough that I could feel it. "You never said," she whispered, "any of it. You could have told everyone who you really are, and you never once did." "I didn't want you to love me because a stranger in a suit looked impressed," I said. "I wanted you to love me because you finally saw me. Those aren't the same thing, and I've watched too many people confuse them." Diane found her voice before Preston did, though it clearly cost her, the muscles of her throat working before the words came. "I had no idea," she said, and it was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her, except it was addressed to the room, not to me, a defense of her own image rather than an admission of what she'd actually done. "Elena, you should have said something. All these years we assumed—" "You believed exactly what you wanted to believe," I said, quietly enough to stay inside our small circle, because that was easier than discovering I was a person instead of a category. "You told my daughter I chose a paycheck over her. You told her I could barely take care of myself. None of that was ever true, Diane." Preston, to whatever credit or shame it deserves, said nothing. For the first time in a long while, he looked like a man doing math he should have done years earlier, and not liking any of the numbers. "I want to be honest about this last part, because I think it matters more than the champagne glass." Diane recovered her composure within about 90 seconds. If nothing else, she is extremely good at recovering. And I watched her pivot almost immediately into damage control, murmuring something to the lifestyle magazine reporter about an extraordinary, humbling evening and the true meaning of quiet service, already reshaping the story into something she could survive. I let her do it. I had no interest in publicly destroying her, and I want to be clear that this wasn't restraint performed for an audience. It was simply that humiliating her further would have cost Maddie more than I was willing to let her pay. What I did instead, quietly, before I left, was find the reporter myself, a young woman named Priya, who had been taking careful notes since the champagne glass hit the floor, and I told her, plainly, in 3 sentences, the true shape of the last 11 years, that I had served continuously without a single gap, that I had never once stopped supporting my daughter, and that whatever version of this family story she might have heard before tonight deserved a second, more honest draft. I didn't ask her to write anything damaging about Diane. I only asked her to write the truth. Whatever happened to Diane's reputation after that was the consequence of 11 years of choices, not something I staged that night. As for Ashford Aerotech, I never touched that file again. Not that week, not the following month, not even after the article ran. It moved through the review process on its own merits, like every other file in my bureau, handled by analysts who had no idea it belonged to my ex-husband's family and no reason to care either way. Much later, I heard secondhand that it had passed review. I felt nothing particular about that. It had never been mine to sink. I found Preston at the valet stand instead of out on some balcony, retrieving the case I'd checked under a name that meant nothing to anyone 3 hours earlier. Same young man,
handing it back without a flicker of recognition, while I wound the security cable around my wrist the way I'd done hundreds of times before, in hundreds of other hotel lobbies, long before anyone in that ballroom knew my rank. His tie was already loose, and he looked considerably older than he had at the start of the evening. "Why didn't I know any of it?" he asked, watching the young man hand me back the case. "The rank, Helmond, any of it."
"Because you stopped asking about my life the day you decided your mother's opinion of me mattered more than your own," I said. "You didn't leave because I chose a career over you, Preston. You left because that was easier than defending me to a mother who was never going to accept anything I did." He didn't argue. He looked out at the dark parking lot for a long moment, then said quietly, "I used to tell Maddie you loved the uniform more than us. There was a while I actually believed that. It was easier than believing I'd let my mother talk me out of someone better than I deserved." "I know," I said. "I'm not telling you this so you'll apologize. I'm telling you because Maddie needs at least one person in that family willing to say it plainly, at some point, in a way that can still matter after tonight fades." He nodded, and this time he didn't try to make it about himself.
Maddie watched me do all of this without asking what was inside the case. "Is that the contract?" she asked instead, the one he mentioned.
"Part of one," I said. "Not your father's. A different program." She nodded slowly, filing that away, the way she'd started filing away everything else that night. And for the first time since she'd been small enough to hold my hand across a parking lot, she reached for the case herself, carrying it the last 20 steps to the car on her own, as if it were something worth being trusted with. Maddie and I left before dessert. She didn't say much in the car, just leaned her head against the window, watching the highway lights slide past, until somewhere past the exit that led to the base I'd be flying out of the next morning, she said, "Was it hard, Mom, not telling anyone for that long?" "Some days were hard," I said, "but I decided a long time ago that being understood by people who'd already decided not to understand me wasn't worth more than protecting the one person whose understanding actually mattered. I wasn't waiting for Richard Voss to walk into a room and vouch for me, Maddie. I was waiting for you to see me on your own, whenever you were ready. Tonight just happened to arrive faster than I expected." She was quiet for a while after that. Then she reached over and turned the radio down, the way she used to when she was little and wanted to say something serious. "I want to know all of it," she said. "Not tonight, but someday. Everything." "Okay," I said. "Someday." I won't pretend one night in a ballroom healed 11 years in a single evening, or that Diane Ashford woke up the next morning a different person. People who've spent a lifetime believing a convenient version of themselves rarely dismantle it after one humbling night. They just build a more careful one and keep going. The magazine piece ran 3 weeks later, shorter than Diane wanted and more accurate than she'd hoped, closing with one line Priya insisted on keeping in, that the Foundation's founder, when asked, acknowledged her family story of service was more complicated and more complete than it had been told before. Diane never mentioned that line to me, and I didn't need her to. What changed was smaller and more lasting than a headline. Maddie began choosing real time with me instead of court-ordered weekends, asking real questions, making me explain my work until it stopped being a mystery to her. Preston, to his limited but genuine credit, stopped correcting the story himself and let his daughter correct it on her own time, which for a man like him was close to the bravest thing I'd ever seen him do. I never asked Richard Voss for anything beyond what my job required, and he never offered anything beyond a formal, proper professional relationship afterward, exactly as it should have been. I never kept score on that debt. The one debt that had only ever been mine to pay was simpler than his, a daughter who no longer had to feel ashamed of half of where she came from. I still think about that ballroom sometimes, the sound of the glass breaking on the parquet floor, exactly half a second before anyone in the room knew what to do with the silence that followed. I understand now that wasn't the most important moment of that night. The most important moment was the ride home afterward, a 17-year-old leaning her head against a car window, finally brave enough to ask the questions she'd been afraid to ask for years, and a mother, for the first time in a long time, allowed to simply answer them. If you've ever sat in a room that decided who you were before you got the chance to say a word, I'd love to hear your story. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight and what finally made the truth catch up. If stories like this one mean something to you, stay a while. There's another family, another silence, another reckoning waiting in the next video.